Every once in a while, I think about, how my life would have been if not for this. At times, I believe I deserve forgiveness, that I'm redeemable. I am very, very sorry for what happened. And I wish that I could take it back. What I did, it's not who I am. How could I do something like that? My name is Joshua David Nelson. I'm 40 years old and I'm on death row. I've been here 20 years and I was 18 and like 2 months when I caught this case. My earliest memories were of my father as an alcoholic. I was probably 4 or 5, maybe even younger. As soon as he came in, my mom was waiting on him and it would start. They would argue and it would fill the trailer. And I would run to my room and hide out in my room, crying as I knew what was happening. He was beating on her and I couldn't help her, but I was also terrified that I was next. I was probably 7 when it happened, when they eventually got a divorce. And then I thought it was gonna get a lot better because it's just me and my mom. But it didn't get better. We came down to Florida. Within a year, I had got arrested 4 or 5 times, and it was multiple car thefts and breaking and enterings. I was doing drugs. I experimented with marijuana, alcohol, hard alcohol, beer, some roofies. I even huffed gasoline a couple times. When the courts heard that, they suggested that I go to a drug rehab. I just showed up one day. They just drop you down in one of those places, and there's 10 other boys your age there. They're all there more than likely for the same reason. And me and Keith, we just gravitated toward each other, I guess, and started talking. Became fast friends, really good friends, and the friendship built. The longer we spent in that rehab, we became friends on the streets. Went to the same high school and hung out pretty much every day. Me and Keith started dating 2 sisters, and Tina was the youngest sister, and she started dating Keith. That's how we all came together. Tommy was brought into our group by another friend of ours. He just rolled up on us in his car one time, Tommy did, and I didn't have really much interaction with him at first. He seemed like a decent person, and you know, he was a little bit older than us, and we just started hanging out. When me and Keith was in that rehab together, we would escape the reality of our situation by fantasizing about, yeah, when we get out, we would do all these things, you know, commit crimes, and we would, you know, better our lives, we would get away from all these things. Fast forward to that day, I don't remember exactly how that came up, but it came up. We said we could kill Tommy. We could take his car, take his money, and do whatever we wanted to do, be on our own. At first, I thought it was just blowing off steam at first. I gave it no mind. I didn't think that it was really gonna happen. I wasn't, you know, in the essence, planning it out as you would, you know, meticulously planning it out. I wasn't doing that. Neither was Keith. We called him. He came over, picked us up. We drove around. Keith said, you know, we got to get some money. So he's like, okay. And Keith says, well, if we give you some of that money, will you take us to the rendezvous point so we can pick the money up? And he was like, yeah, I'll take you there. I'll help you out. I still don't have the feeling like, yeah, that's a done deal. That's going to happen. You know, we're going to kill him. So we drive out to this abandoned area. It's undeveloped area in Cape Coral. We tell him, you know, we're going to wait for him. Wait for them to come out here and give us the money. So we get out of the car. The baseball bat came from Tommy. He carried it around the back of his car. He said for protection. So when I got out, I used that as a premise. You know, we're standing out here in the dark in the middle of nowhere. I'm gonna have this bat, just in case somebody comes out of the woods. Me and Keith are outside, and we're kind of talking about what's gonna happen. I say, I'll hit him first, but if I knock him out, you gotta finish him off. Meaning you gotta kill him. Then we talk about, well, how are we gonna get him out of the car? We knew how much he valued that car. He loved that car. Keith had the box cutter. We cut the bumper with the box cutter and told him, hey, you know, when he was driving back here, you must have hit something or something happened to the car and there's a cut on this bumper. He got out. He looked at the bumper. I felt like this rush of adrenaline. I was trying to get myself to do it. And I just couldn't do it. And then I just stepped past that part of me that wasn't allowing me to do that, and I hit him with a baseball bat. He fell down. And then I tried to hit him again, and then I definitely hit him, and he was just crying and screaming, not screaming, but like, you know, moaning and saying, stop, you know, stop, please stop, begging. And then that's when he said, you know, take the car, take the money. And we kind of walked off to the side and said, you know, is that a possibility? Kind of talked amongst ourselves and said, that's not, you know, that's never, you know, we're going to get in trouble for this. Keith says, you know, we had that agreement. If I knock him out, he would finish him. So I hit him with the bat. I hit him again with the bat, and he stopped making noise. He stopped begging. He stopped talking. And Keith pulled out one of his shoestrings from his shoes and tied him up. I say, Keith, you know, it's on you. He's out. That's when Tommy said, I'm not out. And then I walked over there, and then I hit him with the bat several more times, really hard. Everything that I had dealt with my entire life came out at that moment, and all those feelings, all that anger, and it just all happened in that moment. And he was out then, because he didn't say anything else. He didn't resist. And then Keith went over there and started cutting his throat with a box cutter. We drug him to an area with more like shrubs and ground cover, I guess you would say. Said it's just next to a road. We took a big piece of wood and put it over him. And when we drove off, threw the bat in water and a razor away, and we got rid of the clothes we were wearing because we were covered in blood.
My sister had met Josh through McDonald's because he was working there. I met Keith through Josh, and shortly after, we started dating. All of us had problems in our families, and we had all been talking for quite some time about wanting to run away together. And our biggest problem was how any of us were going to go anywhere. And Keith and Josh had said, you know, don't worry about it, that they would get a car. That particular day, they had called and said, we're leaving tonight. And we said, okay, so we just waited around for the phone call to leave our house and walk down the street to be picked up. As soon as we seen Tommy's car, we knew something was wrong. We didn't know if they had somehow convinced Tommy to give up his car or what was going on. They were both very quiet, and we asked, "Where's Tommy?" And Keith responded with, "We killed him."
This is a picture of Tommy when he was about 18. And this is Tommy when he worked at Winn-Dixie. He was about 16 then. And this here was the last picture taken. That's Tommy. That was the Thursday night before he died. And my sister. And that was the car, the Ford Probe that they wanted. I took the picture of him and my sister. He was tickling her ribs. And then the following night is when he got killed. So I know that was the last picture taken of him. Tommy was a very happy, energetic person. He liked cars, installing stereos, always on the go, liked to make friends. I don't think he had any enemies. Never drank, smoked. Couldn't find a better person. He was going to community college, just started taking up criminal law. He wanted to be a cop. And he said, "I'll buy a duplex, and he'll live in one end with his family, and I'll live in the other end. And he's going to have his Lamborghini in the driveway." That's okay. Sounded fine at the time. We didn't know at first what had happened. We never thought it would turn to this. We had gone to Josh's house, talked to his stepfather, and we went to the high school. We were talking to friends. They assumed they all went to Fort Lauderdale. We thought the worst thing was that, being he was not a drug user, they got him on some kind of drug and he's just forgetting to call home. That was the worst thing we thought. But it took 11 days before we knew what had happened. They did the positive ID through the dental records because of the decomposition. 11 days in a field in Florida in the heat.
He should have been able to do everything that he was going to do. And he didn't get to do it. All over a stupid car. I mean, all I have to do is think about it, and I start crying like a little baby. And believe me, I'm pissed. He's lived all this time as my family dies. Coming from a peaceful hippie, this is saying a lot, but I ain't that peaceful. Peace, love, and happiness forever until you brutally murder my brother. I will dedicate my life. I will dedicate my life. They will wish they're better off where they're at because they will not want to meet me when they get out.
This is Tommy's dad. He died on December 4th of '04, cancer, and yeah, he was hoping he could be there at the execution. He was going to eat popcorn in the front row. That was what he said to the reporters back then. But as he got sicker and sicker, we knew he wasn't going to be there. It's just, 22 years is a long time to wait. He's definitely should have been put to death a long time ago. In their minds, they had a reason. They planned. But thinking back, no, there was absolutely no reason. Tommy was trying to tell him, take the car, take the car. He knew they were killing him. But they continued, they made the decision to kill him. They could have just taken a car and left. But they made the wrong choice. Now they're paying for it. And one's going to pay with his life.
When I was 19, I was married to Peggy, and she is the mother of Heather, our daughter. And Peggy is also the mother of Josh Nelson. I think I was divorced at 21, and Josh came along about 3 years later. I can remember as Heather was 6 months old, feeling just concern on a bigger level as to the maternal care that Peggy was able to give to her. I can remember I could hear Heather crying in the back of the house, and I might go and check on Heather, and she'd quiet down. And then once Peggy got up, and I heard her go to the back of the trailer, and the crying stopped quite suddenly. To a point that I was just conscious of it. It just seemed different. And I got up to walk back just to see what was going on. And as I went into the room, Peggy stepped back from Heather, the baby, and had a pillow in her hand. And it appeared as if Peggy was holding the pillow over Heather's face. When she stepped back, Heather started crying again. And I couldn't see it directly, but it felt very much to me as if that's what was going on. And I questioned Peggy about it, and she denied it. She said she was just, she was just trying to comfort Heather. And there were a few incidents similar to that. When I did get custody of Heather, I can remember asking Heather, is this something that you want? Because, you know, you don't know for sure how kids feel about this. And I can remember Heather saying, well, yes, she did want to come to Michigan and stay with me, but she was very concerned about Josh. She says, I don't want to leave Josh there by himself.
My mom was not nurturing. I would say that she did not have the mothering ability. I think that there was just a void inside of her that she wasn't able to be the mother that myself and Josh needed, that children are supposed to have. Alan, Josh's dad, the alcoholic part, I think is what defined him, because I know that he was physically abusive to Josh. I mean, he spanked him a lot. He yelled at him a lot. But I guess I don't know how much of that went on more when I wasn't there than when I was visiting. You know, if that's one of those things that people behind closed doors, I don't know. It's kind of hard now. I think that that kind of an environment destroyed Josh. He was never given the values, the morals. I don't think he was ever taught how to love. And when you don't have that, you can't give that. And you can't, there's just nothing, like I said, I mean, I just don't think that he ever had a chance. When they moved to Florida in like 1991, that kind of cut off any communication or ties to family. I found out about the sexual abuse that was going on with him and Greg, his stepdad, during the trial. I mean, I had no idea. From what I read in the reports, Greg sexually abusing Josh was a daily thing, a weekly thing. It was not a every once in a while thing. It was from the way that the reports read, it was almost that was his entire life.
It first started where I would be in the shower and he would come in there and sit down on the toilet, and you know, obviously I knew something was not right about that. Eventually one night he came into my room and he started touching me in my private, my penis, and I tried to roll away, and then he was persistent, and then I would try to roll. I acted like I was asleep. I acted like it wasn't existing. I mean, it wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. And I sunk deeper inside myself, and eventually I got an erection. I was young, and my body responded, and then he would perform oral sex on me. When he would do that, I can't describe what I can't describe what I felt. I felt nothing. I felt absolutely nothing. And like I said, I just sunk deeper inside myself. running away from myself. Eventually, I got up the courage to tell my mom, after it had been happening for six months, a year. I sat her down and I looked at her and I said, Mom, this is what he's doing to me. And she called him into the room and he acknowledged it. He said he thought that I liked it. That's why he was doing it. And she told him that if he ever did it again, that she would kill him. And I'm sitting there thinking the whole time, if he ever does it again, what about the times he did it? You know, what about all those times that he did it?
I find it hard to believe that an innocent child is sitting on a death row. And there's no accountability for the people who have put him where he is. I mean, I wish that I could have saved him. I wish that somebody would have just saved him. Because nobody deserves that. There were so many people who could have saved him. Adults who should have stepped in. Whether when he was 2 or 12, nobody had his back. And I'm sorry that I didn't.
They made him stop for a little while, maybe a month or 2, maybe 3 months. But yeah, it didn't stop. Yeah, he approached me again. By this time I was 18 and I felt like it wasn't going to let it happen anymore. And he didn't react, but he's like, you know, you need to come with me. We need to go talk to your mom. I was like, yeah, let's go talk to my mom. So, but he manipulated the situation where he wanted me to wait out in the car and while he went in and talked to my mom. So in hindsight, who knows, I was just trusting. For whatever reason, I don't know, I just trusted those in that position. I guess like an authority figure, I just trusted them. And he went in, talked to my mom, and she came out livid, pissed. Told me to give her my key, and I was out. I had to get out. And I had no job, I had no money. I had to get my clothes and get out. So I was like, all right, what can I do?
One night, my sister and I went to Josh's house to see Keith and Josh, and Keith was not there. I was going to walk to a payphone to call Keith, and Tommy was there that night, and he said that I could use the phone in his car. When we got into his car, he told me that we would have to drive up the road to where he could get service in order for me to make a call, and I agreed. Instead, he drove me to a remote area where no one else was around and proceeded to sexually assault me. And I had no intention of saying anything, but my sister could tell there was something wrong with me. As soon as I told her, she told Josh everything that happened. Of course, Josh was furious. At first, Tommy denied everything, but later on, finally admitted what he had done. When I first found out what happened, I was glad Tommy was gone. That was my initial thought, and I would never have to deal with him again. The guilt came afterwards. Not that I felt they did what they did simply because of what Tommy did to me. I knew they both had problems in their own lives, but I felt that telling them what had happened to me was the straw that broke the camel's back. A lot of lives were lost that night. Not just Tommy's. A lot of people were hurt. A lot of people were destroyed. Josh, Keith, the entire Owens family. Nobody will ever be the same after that night. Josh will always have a very special place in my heart. He's a good-hearted person. He was a scared kid. He had a lot of damage done to him in his life, and it came out in a terrible way.
It could have happened. We don't know. I don't think it's relevant. They mentioned that at trial. They were all friends. And there was no forcing or rape. It just wasn't talked about, except brought up that one time, and that was the end of it. They planned it, premeditated. They wanted his car. They killed him. To lure somebody into the woods, to lure them out of their own car, and to beat him with a baseball bat and slice his throat. And he's begging for his life and say, take the car. And they still, no, we're going to kill you. And they did. And what did they gain? They're in prison and my son's gone. So no, I wouldn't forgive them. I hope they burn in hell.
I still can't fully emotionally feel and understand and comprehend what I did that night. How could I do something like that? How could I, especially after being a victim my whole life, being other people's victim, that I would go out and just brutally victimize somebody like that? Because I mean, I'm totally responsible for that. No one else is responsible for it. I did that, and I want to take it back so bad. I want to remove that pain that I caused from everybody. I want to bring him back to life, but I can't. I don't know how. I don't know how to make amends. I don't know how to apologize. I don't know how, I don't know what, I don't know what to say.
So, he takes responsibility enough, but that's more or less all he said, that he's had all these years to think about that he is responsible for what happened, but I don't feel any different towards him. Because of that statement, it's not like I should forgive him. No. I think it's the words he needs to say right now, because he knows his execution date is getting closer. And he'll say anything to get some sympathy. But at the time, he didn't say nothing. He actually made a face at us leaving the courtroom. And that was brought up at trial, that he gave us a smirk. The only thing he was sorry for was getting caught.
I don't recall that, but I would never smirk at them about something like that. I might have smirked about something that someone was saying on the stand, or something that I didn't agree with, but even at that time, I wouldn't do that at them.
Not that I felt they did what they did simply because of what Tommy did to me. I felt that telling them what had happened to me was the straw that broke the camel's back.
That's a hard question to answer, because, I think things happen. There are a series of things that happens that leads up to something. I don't think that was the defining factor of killing him. No. But that was definitely a factor. That made him not so innocent, to me.
On the afternoon of April 1st, SIL 1988, the city of Fort Wayne, Indiana, looked much like countless other Midwestern communities at the beginning of spring. Winter's grip had finally begun to loosen. Neighborhood streets were filling with children eager to spend more time outdoors. Bicycles rolled across sidewalks, and families prepared for another ordinary weekend. There was little reason for anyone to imagine that within hours, one of the state's most haunting criminal investigations would begin. It would become a case that investigators, journalists, and residents would remember for decades, not simply because of its brutality, but because it would remain unanswered for 30 years before advances in forensic science finally changed everything. 8-year-old April Marie Tinsley was known as a cheerful child who enjoyed spending time outside near her home. Friends and neighbors later described the neighborhood as one where children often walked short distances alone, a reflection of the era and the trust many families placed in their community. It was Good Friday weekend, and schools had closed for the holiday. The afternoon offered children an opportunity to play while parents finished work or prepared for Easter celebration. Nothing about those hours suggested they would soon become the starting point of one of Indiana's longest-running cold cases. According to investigators, April left her home during the afternoon to visit friends who lived only a short distance away. It was a routine trip that should have taken only minutes. Instead, somewhere along that familiar route, she vanished. When she failed to return home, concern quickly spread through her family. At first, relatives assumed there might be a simple explanation. Perhaps she had stayed longer with friends or had become distracted while playing. As time passed, however, ordinary concern turned into fear. Family members began searching nearby streets and knocking on neighbors' doors. Friends were questioned. Nearby parks and vacant lots were checked. As daylight faded, it became increasingly clear that something was terribly wrong. Local police were notified, and officers responded quickly, treating the disappearance with growing urgency. In 1988, the investigative procedures available to law enforcement differed greatly from those used today. There were no smartphones recording movements, no social media posts documenting a person's last known location, and no network of surveillance cameras capturing every street corner. Detectives had to rely on eyewitness accounts, physical evidence, and painstaking door-to-door interviews. As news of the missing child spread across Fort Wayne, volunteers joined officers in an expanding search effort. Residents searched wooded areas, drainage ditches, fields, and neighborhoods surrounding April's home. Missing person flyers began appearing throughout the city. Local television stations interrupted regular programming to broadcast photographs of the young girl, urging anyone with information to contact authorities immediately. Every passing hour increased concern that this was no ordinary missing person case. The search continued through the night and into the following day. Hope remained that April would be found alive. Investigators pursued every lead available, interviewing classmates, neighbors, family friends, and anyone who might have seen her walking that afternoon. Reports poured in from members of the public, many of which ultimately proved unrelated. Such responses are common in high-profile child disappearance cases, often creating an enormous investigative burden while detectives attempt to separate meaningful information from mistaken observation. Then came the discovery that transformed the investigation into a homicide. On April 2nd, approximately one day after she disappeared, April Tinsley's body was found in a ditch along a rural road in DeKalb County, roughly 20 miles from Fort Wayne. The location immediately suggested that whoever had abducted her had transported her away from the neighborhood before abandoning the scene. Detectives secured the area while forensic specialists carefully documented every piece of potential evidence. The isolation of the location raised difficult questions. Why had this particular roadside been chosen? Had the offender been familiar with the area? Was it selected at random, or did it hold some significance to the person responsible? The investigation rapidly expanded beyond city limits as agencies from multiple jurisdictions coordinated their efforts. Detectives faced an offender who had left remarkably few immediate clues regarding identity. Yet the crime scene contained evidence that investigators carefully preserved, believing it might someday prove essential. At the time, however, forensic DNA technology remained in its infancy. While biological evidence could be collected and stored, the scientific methods capable of identifying an unknown offender through genetic analysis were still years away from becoming practical investigative tools. An autopsy established that April had been the victim of homicide. Authorities released only limited details about the circumstances, carefully balancing the need to protect the investigation with the public's demand for information. Detectives hoped that withholding certain facts would later help distinguish genuine confessions from false ones. Throughout the investigation, officials remained cautious about discussing specific forensic findings, recognizing that even seemingly minor details could become critical if a suspect were eventually identified. Shock spread rapidly across northeastern Indiana. Residents struggled to comprehend how such a crime could occur within a community many considered safe. Parents who had previously allowed children to walk to friends' homes without hesitation suddenly changed daily routines. Schools reviewed safety procedures. Neighborhood organizations encouraged residents to report suspicious activity immediately. Conversations once focused on Easter plans shifted toward fear, uncertainty, and unanswered questions. Law enforcement agencies assembled a large investigative team. Detectives reviewed April's known movements minute by minute. They reconstructed her route, interviewed everyone who had seen her that day, and examined vehicles reported near the neighborhood. Individuals with prior criminal histories involving offenses against children received particular attention. Hundreds of tips arrived from across Indiana and neighboring states, requiring investigators to evaluate each one carefully. The absence of obvious witnesses complicated the investigation. Unlike crimes occurring in crowded public spaces, April's disappearance appeared to have taken place during a brief period when few people observed exactly what happened. Detectives explored multiple possibilities regarding the method of abduction, but publicly emphasized only those facts supported by evidence. Their objective remained clear: identify the individual responsible without allowing speculation to overwhelm documented information. As days turned into weeks, the investigation expanded further. Search warrants were executed, vehicles were examined, potential suspects voluntarily submitted interviews, while others required closer scrutiny. Physical evidence recovered during the investigation was analyzed using the best forensic methods available in the late 1980s. Fingerprints, fibers, hair samples, tire impressions, and biological material all became part of an extensive evidence collection that investigators hoped would eventually reveal the offender's identity. Meanwhile, April's family confronted unimaginable grief under intense public attention. News organizations continued covering developments almost daily. Community vigils honored the young victim, while churches filled with residents seeking comfort and answers. Across Fort Wayne, one question echoed repeatedly: who could commit such a crime against an 8-year-old child? Investigators remained determined, but the early momentum common in major homicide cases gradually encountered familiar obstacles. Promising leads failed to produce arrests. Reported sightings proved inaccurate. Persons of interest were eliminated through investigation. Detectives repeatedly returned to the evidence, hoping overlooked details might reveal a new direction. Each review reinforced the same troubling reality. Despite substantial investigative effort, the identity of the killer remained unknown. Years before genetic genealogy would transform criminal investigations, detectives could only preserve evidence for future scientific advances they could scarcely imagine. Careful documentation became an investment in hope. Every item collected from the crime scene, every laboratory report, every witness statement, and every photograph entered an expanding archive that future investigators might someday revisit with technologies unavailable in 1988. For the citizens of Fort Wayne and surrounding communities, April Tinsley's murder became more than a criminal investigation. It evolved into a lasting reminder of vulnerability and loss. Children who had once played freely outdoors grew up remembering the warnings that followed her death. Parents who participated in neighborhood searches never forgot those anxious hours. Detectives assigned to the case carried its unanswered questions throughout their careers, refusing to abandon the possibility that one day, somewhere, one overlooked clue or one scientific breakthrough would finally identify the person responsible. At the close of those first critical weeks, investigators possessed a homicide victim, an extensive collection of physical evidence, hundreds of interviews, and a community desperate for justice. What they did not possess was the one element that mattered most: the name of the killer. That absence would define the investigation for decades, transforming the murder of April Tinsley into one of Indiana's most enduring cold cases. Its evidence preserved in silence while time marched forward and science slowly caught up with a mystery that refused to disappear. In the weeks following the murder of 8-year-old April Tinsley, investigators confronted one of the most difficult transitions any major homicide inquiry can face. The frantic urgency of the first 48 hours had given way to a slower, methodical process driven by evidence, interviews, and forensic analysis. Every detective understood that the earliest days after a violent crime often produce the strongest leads. Yet despite hundreds of interviews and an expanding file of reports, no clear suspect had emerged. The investigation was growing in size, but not in certainty. Fort Wayne, Indiana, was no longer simply a city mourning the loss of a child. It had become a community living with unanswered questions. Parents adjusted routines that had once seemed ordinary. Children who had previously walked or ridden bicycles through neighborhoods without supervision were now escorted by adults. Schools reinforced safety messages reminding students not to accept rides from strangers and to report anything unusual immediately. Conversations at workplaces, churches, and local businesses often returned to the same subject. People compared rumors, recalled unfamiliar vehicles, and wondered whether the person responsible might still be living nearby. Investigators from multiple law enforcement agencies coordinated their efforts, recognizing that the offender had transported April from Fort Wayne to a rural location in neighboring DeKalb County. That movement suggested planning and familiarity with local roads. Detectives examined maps, reconstructed travel routes, and attempted to determine where the offender might have encountered April before leaving the area. Every possible timeline was scrutinized. Officers revisited neighborhoods repeatedly, hoping that a resident might remember a detail overlooked during the emotional chaos immediately following the disappearance. The investigative strategy relied heavily on traditional police work. Long before the era of digital surveillance and automatic license plate readers, detectives depended on witness statements, physical evidence, and persistence. Hundreds of people were interviewed: family members, neighbors, classmates, teachers, delivery drivers, utility workers, and anyone known to have been in the area during the afternoon of April 1st, still 1988, became part of the inquiry. Detectives documented even seemingly insignificant observations, understanding that a minor inconsistency could later become a critical lesson. Physical evidence collected during the investigation received careful laboratory examination using the forensic techniques available at the time. Biological samples, fibers, fingerprints, and other trace evidence were analyzed and preserved. Although DNA profiling was beginning to emerge as an investigative tool during the late 1980s, its practical application remained limited. Scientists could not yet use genetic evidence in the sophisticated ways that later generations would consider routine. Even so, investigators recognized the potential future value of preserving every piece of evidence under proper conditions. As the investigation continued, law enforcement received an overwhelming number of tips from the public. Major cases involving child victims often generate thousands of leads, and April Tinsley's murder proved no exception. Some callers reported suspicious vehicles. Others identified individuals whose behavior had changed after the crime. Many tips were submitted in good faith but ultimately proved unrelated. Each required evaluation. Detectives understood that dismissing a lead too quickly carried obvious risks, yet pursuing every possibility demanded enormous time and resources. Public interest remained intense. Local newspapers published regular updates, while television stations covered developments whenever investigators announced new information. Law enforcement carefully balanced transparency with investigative necessity. Certain details about the crime were intentionally withheld. Maintaining confidential facts allowed detectives to evaluate future confessions and witness statements against information known only to investigators and the offender. Despite the extensive investigative effort, weeks gradually turned into months without an arrest. The absence of a suspect placed increasing pressure on detectives. Every major child homicide carries profound emotional weight, but unresolved cases present an additional burden. Investigators often describe the frustration of knowing that a dangerous offender remains unidentified while evidence grows older and memories begin to fade. Then the investigation took an alarming turn. Approximately 1 year after April's murder, residents in parts of Fort Wayne began discovering handwritten messages that appeared to reference the crime. These communications, left in public places, drew immediate attention from law enforcement because of their disturbing content. Investigators believed the author either possessed knowledge of the crime or was deliberately attempting to exploit public fear. The letters intensified anxiety throughout the community and introduced an entirely new dimension to an already complex investigation. Authorities immediately collected the writings for forensic examination. Handwriting specialists analyzed the documents, while investigators searched for fingerprints and other physical evidence. Detectives also studied the language itself, attempting to identify patterns that might reveal characteristics of the writer. At the time, behavioral analysis was becoming an increasingly valuable investigative resource. Specialists considered whether the communications reflected an attempt by the offender to relive the crime, seek attention, or manipulate the investigation. The appearance of the letters significantly affected public perception. Many residents concluded that the killer remained nearby and was confident enough to taunt both investigators and the community. Whether that conclusion reflected reality or not, the psychological impact was undeniable. Fear, already present after April's murder, deepened considerably. Investigators responded by expanding patrols in affected neighborhoods and encouraging residents to report suspicious activity immediately. Officers distributed additional safety information and urged parents to remain vigilant. Community meetings provided opportunities for citizens to ask questions, although detectives remained limited in what they could disclose publicly. The possibility that the offender had deliberately communicated after the murder also influenced investigative strategy. Detectives reviewed earlier reports involving unusual behavior, harassment complaints, and incidents that might previously have appeared unrelated. Individuals with histories of offenses involving children received renewed attention. Existing files were re-examined in light of the new evidence. Behavioral experts offered cautious observations. While offender profiling cannot identify a specific individual, it can sometimes assist investigators by narrowing investigative priorities. Analysts considered whether the offender demonstrated organized planning, familiarity with the area, or a desire for continued psychological control after the crime. Such assessments remained investigative tools rather than definitive conclusions, but they contributed to the broader effort to understand the unknown offender. Meanwhile, forensic evidence continued to be preserved with exceptional care. Investigators understood that scientific capabilities were evolving rapidly. Although existing laboratory methods could not fully exploit every piece of biological evidence collected in 1988, experienced detectives recognized that future advances might accomplish what current technology could not. That foresight would later prove extraordinarily important. As the first anniversary of April's murder approached, memorial services reminded the community that justice remained elusive. Family members, friends, investigators, and residents gathered to remember the young girl whose life had ended so suddenly. The anniversary also renewed media attention, prompting another wave of public tips. Detectives carefully reviewed every submission, aware that major anniversaries sometimes encourage witnesses to come forward with information they had previously withheld. Still, no arrest followed. The investigation entered a difficult phase familiar to many major unsolved cases. Active work continued every day, but public visibility gradually declined. New cases demanded police resources. Detectives rotated assignments. Supervisors changed. Yet the April Tinsley investigation remained open. Evidence was cataloged, witness statements preserved, and investigative files maintained in anticipation of future developments. Cold cases rarely become inactive because investigators stop caring. More often, they persist because available evidence cannot yet answer the central question. That reality increasingly defined the Tinsley investigation. Detectives believed someone possessed the necessary information, whether the offender, an associate, or an unwitting witness. The challenge lay in connecting that unknown individual to the physical evidence already collected. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, forensic science continued advancing. DNA profiling gradually became more reliable and increasingly accepted within the criminal justice system. Laboratories improved their ability to analyze biological material that previously produced limited results. Although these developments did not immediately solve April's murder, investigators followed each advancement with growing interest. Every improvement represented another possibility that preserved evidence might someday reveal what conventional investigation had failed to uncover. Within law enforcement circles, April Tinsley's case became an example of why meticulous evidence preservation matters. Detectives who inherited the investigation from retiring colleagues received comprehensive files documenting every interview, every laboratory examination, every search warrant, and every investigative theory. Continuity became essential. Even as personnel changed, the evidence remained. The community, meanwhile, continued living with uncertainty. Children who had been in elementary school during April's disappearance gradually became adults. Some left Indiana altogether. Others remained, carrying vivid memories of neighborhood searches, newspaper headlines, and conversations about personal safety that had shaped an entire generation. For many residents, the case never truly faded. It became part of the city's collective memory, a painful reminder that justice had not yet been achieved. As another year passed, investigators faced the same stark reality confronting them since April 1988. They possessed an extensive investigative record, carefully preserved forensic evidence, and an unwavering commitment to solving the crime. What remained absent was the breakthrough capable of transforming suspicion into proof. The case had survived its first years without resolution, but neither detectives nor April Tinsley's family intended to let it disappear into forgotten archive. Unknown to everyone involved, the evidence waiting inside those storage rooms would one day speak with a clarity impossible in 1988. But that moment still lay decades in the future. By the early 1990s, the investigation into the murder of April Tinsley had entered a stage familiar to many long-running homicide cases. The intense activity that followed the crime in April 1988 had gradually given way to a quieter but no less determined effort. Detectives continued working the case, but the focus shifted from responding to immediate leads to repeatedly reviewing existing evidence, evaluating new information, and monitoring advances in forensic science that might eventually provide answers unavailable at the time of the murder. The case was never considered closed. Instead, it became what law enforcement refers to as an active cold Case 1, in which investigators continue to pursue credible leads despite the passage of time. Maintaining such investigations requires careful organization. Thousands of pages of reports, witness interviews, laboratory analyses, photographs, maps, evidence logs, and correspondence had accumulated during the initial investigation. Every document represented information that might later become significant if viewed alongside new evidence or new investigative technique. One of the first priorities during the early 1990s was ensuring that every piece of physical evidence collected in 1988 remained properly preserved. Advances in forensic science were occurring at a remarkable pace. Detectives understood that evidence which could not be fully analyzed when it was first collected might someday be examined using technologies still under development. Biological samples, clothing, trace materials, and other exhibits were therefore maintained under carefully controlled conditions to preserve their evidentiary value. The decision to preserve evidence with exceptional care reflected a broader change occurring throughout American law enforcement. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, DNA profiling was becoming increasingly accepted as a powerful investigative tool. Early cases demonstrated that biological evidence could identify offenders with a level of certainty that traditional forensic methods often could not achieve. At the same time, investigators recognized that the technology remained limited. Many laboratories required relatively large, high-quality samples, and testing procedures were time-consuming and expensive compared to later standards. Detectives assigned to the April Tinsley investigation regularly consulted forensic specialists to determine whether newly developed laboratory methods could provide additional information. Whenever significant technological improvements became available, investigators evaluated whether preserved evidence should undergo further testing. These reviews were conducted carefully because forensic examinations can consume portions of biological samples. Decisions, therefore, required balancing the potential value of immediate testing against the possibility that future methods might prove even more effective. Beyond forensic evidence, investigators also revisited witness statements collected during the original investigation. Human memory presents unique challenges in long-term criminal investigations. As years pass, recollections naturally become less precise. However, detectives also know that witnesses sometimes remember previously overlooked details when questioned again or when confronted with photographs, maps, or other records from the original investigation. Teams systematically compared statements taken in 1988 with subsequent interviews, searching for inconsistencies or overlooked connections. Individuals who had lived near April's neighborhood, worked along her likely route, or reported suspicious observations during the days surrounding her disappearance were recontacted whenever practical. While many interviews simply confirmed earlier accounts, detectives considered each review worthwhile. Cold cases have occasionally been solved because a witness recalled one seemingly minor fact years after the original investigation. Investigators also re-examine persons of interest identified during the initial inquiry. In any major homicide investigation, detectives often evaluate numerous individuals whose backgrounds, locations, or behaviors warrant closer examination. As new information became available throughout the 1990s, authorities compared it against existing case files to determine whether anyone previously investigated deserved renewed scrutiny. Criminal history databases expanded considerably during this period. Information sharing between law enforcement agencies improved, allowing investigators to identify patterns that might previously have gone unnoticed. Detectives considered whether individuals investigated in the April Tinsley case had later been arrested for offenses involving violence or crimes against children. Such reviews did not establish guilt, but they helped investigators prioritize future inquiries. Public cooperation continued to play an important role. Although media attention naturally declined compared with the immediate aftermath of the crime, periodic anniversary coverage encouraged additional tips from members of the public. Investigators evaluated each submission regardless of how much time had passed. Experience has shown that information withheld for years can sometimes become available because relationships change, memories are revisited, or individuals decide to come forward after previously remaining silent. Throughout the decade, detectives remained cautious about releasing sensitive investigative information. Certain facts about the crime continued to be withheld from public disclosure. This long-standing investigative practice serves multiple purposes. It protects the integrity of future witness interviews, assists in evaluating confessions, and preserves details that only the offender or someone with direct knowledge of the crime would be expected to know. The investigation also reflected increasing collaboration between local, state, and federal agencies. As forensic science evolved and criminal databases expanded, partnerships among law enforcement organizations became increasingly important. Specialists with expertise in forensic biology, behavioral analysis, crime scene reconstruction, and evidence management contributed perspectives that complemented traditional investigative methods. Behavioral analysis received growing attention during the 1990s, although investigators recognized its limitations. Profiling cannot identify a specific offender, nor can it replace physical evidence. Instead, behavioral assessments may assist detectives in evaluating investigative priorities by considering patterns observed in similar crimes. Any such assessments remained one component of a much broader investigation grounded primarily in documented evidence. Meanwhile, the impact of the crime continued to be felt throughout Fort Wayne and surrounding communities. Annual news coverage served as a reminder that the murder remained unsolved. April Tinsley's family consistently expressed hope that someone with information would come forward. Law enforcement agencies likewise emphasized that the investigation remained active and encouraged anyone with relevant knowledge to contact investigators, regardless of how insignificant the information might appear. Within police departments, personnel changes presented additional challenges. Detectives retired, supervisors accepted new assignments, and younger investigators inherited responsibility for reviewing extensive case files assembled years earlier. Successful cold case investigations depend heavily upon detailed documentation, allowing new investigators to understand prior decisions, evaluate existing evidence, and avoid repeating earlier work unnecessarily. The April Tinsley case benefited from comprehensive record-keeping. Original reports documented investigative steps in considerable detail, preserving the reasoning behind interviews, searches, forensic examination, and other decisions made during the initial investigation. Such documentation allowed subsequent investigators to build upon previous work rather than beginning anew. As forensic science progressed, DNA databases also expanded. The Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, developed during the 1990s and implemented more broadly over time, became an increasingly valuable investigative resource. CODIS allowed participating laboratories to compare DNA profiles from crime scenes against profiles obtained from convicted offenders and, in some jurisdictions, certain arrestees. Investigators considered whether biological evidence preserved in the April Tinsley investigation might eventually be suitable for comparison through these developing systems. However, early DNA databases depended upon the offender's profile already existing within the system. If the person responsible had never provided a qualifying DNA sample, no match would occur. Consequently, while CODIS represented a significant advancement, detectives understood that it might not immediately identify the offender responsible for April's murder. The 1990s also witnessed dramatic improvements in laboratory sensitivity. Scientists became increasingly capable of analyzing smaller quantities of biological material than had previously been possible. Each advancement encouraged investigators to reassess evidence preserved from older cases. Nonetheless, technology alone could not guarantee success. The quality, quantity, and condition of available evidence remained critical factors influencing laboratory results. Throughout these years, investigators demonstrated a consistent commitment to preserving every reasonable opportunity for future scientific examination. Evidence storage procedures, chain of custody documentation, and laboratory protocols reflected an understanding that future technologies might achieve what contemporary methods could not. For the broader public, however, visible progress appeared limited. Years had passed without an arrest. Children who had been classmates of April Tinsley were entering adulthood. New criminal investigations occupied newspaper headlines. Yet for those directly involved family members, detectives, prosecutors, and forensic specialists, the case remained unfinished. Cold cases often require extraordinary patience. Unlike investigations driven by immediate breakthroughs, they depend upon the gradual accumulation of scientific knowledge, improved investigative methods, and persistent review of evidence that may appear unchanged for years. The April Tinsley investigation increasingly embodied that reality. By the close of the 1990s, detectives had not identified the individual responsible for April's murder. Nevertheless, the investigation possessed one significant advantage that many earlier homicide cases lacked: carefully preserved physical evidence maintained with future forensic testing in mind. Although investigators could not yet predict precisely how scientific advances would evolve, they believed the evidence still held unanswered questions. That belief would ultimately prove justified. The meticulous decisions made during the original investigation and reinforced throughout the 1990s ensured that critical evidence remained available for future examination. While justice had not yet been achieved, the foundation for future breakthroughs had quietly been preserved, waiting for scientific capabilities that were still years away from becoming reality. As the 1990s gave way to the early 2000s, the murder of April Tinsley remained one of Indiana's most recognized unsolved child homicide investigations. More than a decade had passed since 8-year-old April disappeared while walking to a friend's home in Fort Wayne on April 1st, still 1988, and was found deceased the following day in rural DeKalb County. Despite thousands of investigative hours, numerous interviews, and the careful preservation of physical evidence, the identity of the offender remained unknown. Yet, unlike many cold cases from earlier generations, investigators had reason to believe that science, not chance, might eventually provide the breakthrough they needed. During this period, law enforcement agencies across the United States increasingly established formal cold case programs. These units were created to systematically review unsolved homicides using modern investigative technique. Rather than assuming older cases had reached a dead end, detectives approached them with a simple premise. Evidence collected decades earlier could reveal new information when examined through the lens of advancing forensic science. The April Tinsley investigation benefited from this changing philosophy. Detectives periodically reopened the case file, not because of a single dramatic new lead, but because forensic capabilities continued to improve. Every significant advance prompted investigators to ask the same question: could technology now extract information that had been impossible to obtain years before? One of the investigation's greatest strengths was the condition in which critical evidence had been preserved. Crime scene technicians and investigators in 1988 had followed procedures that maintained the integrity of biological material recovered during the investigation. Although DNA analysis was still relatively limited at that time, they recognized its potential importance. As laboratory methods improved through the 1990s and into the new century, that foresight became increasingly valuable. DNA profiling itself evolved significantly during these years. Earlier testing methods often required relatively large, well-preserved samples. By the early 2000s, laboratories could develop usable DNA profiles from much smaller quantities of biological material. Improvements in extraction methods, amplification techniques, and contamination control expanded the range of evidence suitable for analysis. Investigators worked closely with forensic scientists to determine whether preserved evidence from the April Tinsley case should undergo additional testing. Such decisions required careful consideration. Biological evidence is finite, and some laboratory procedures consume portions of a sample. Detectives therefore sought expert guidance before authorizing further analysis, balancing the possibility of immediate results against preserving material for even more advanced techniques that might emerge later. The investigation also benefited from the continuing expansion of national forensic databases. The Combined DNA Index System, commonly known as CODIS, became an increasingly important investigative resource. Once laboratories generated a suitable DNA profile from crime scene evidence, investigators could compare it against profiles already contained within the database. CODIS represented a major advance over traditional investigative methods because it allowed biological evidence from one case to be electronically compared with thousands of known offender profiles. However, detectives also understood its limitations. A successful match depended on the responsible individual already having a qualifying DNA profile in the system. If the offender had never submitted DNA through a criminal conviction or another qualifying circumstance, the search would produce no identification. As forensic laboratories periodically updated DNA profiles using improved analytical methods, investigators submitted available evidence for comparison whenever appropriate. According to publicly documented accounts of the investigation, these searches did not initially identify the offender. The absence of a match was disappointing, but it also provided useful information. It suggested that the person responsible either had no qualifying DNA profile within CODIS or had otherwise avoided identification through existing forensic databases. Meanwhile, detectives continued reviewing the extensive investigative record assembled over the previous decade. Cold case investigations rarely rely on a single line of inquiry. Instead, they combine physical evidence, witness interviews, criminal intelligence, forensic science, and careful documentation accumulated over many years. Investigators revisited original witness statements, comparing them against later interviews and newly available records. Advances in computerized record systems made searching historical investigative files considerably more efficient than in 1988, when many reports existed only in paper form. Detectives could now cross-reference names, addresses, vehicle information, and criminal histories more effectively, helping identify potential connections that might previously have been overlooked. Individuals investigated during the original inquiry also remain subject to periodic review. Detectives examined whether any persons of interest had subsequently committed similar offenses, relocated to other jurisdictions, or become associated with investigations elsewhere. These reviews reflected standard investigative practice rather than evidence of guilt. Cold case detectives routinely reassess earlier investigative decisions to ensure that no credible lead has been inadvertently dismissed. Throughout the early 2000s, behavioral analysis continued developing as a supplementary investigative tool. Specialists reviewed documented facts surrounding the crime, considering offender behavior within established criminological framework. Such assessments were intended to support investigative strategy rather than identify a specific suspect. Law enforcement consistently emphasized that physical evidence remained the foundation of the case. Public interest in April Tinsley's murder persisted, particularly around significant anniversaries. Local media periodically revisited the investigation, interviewing detectives and reminding viewers that the case remained unsolved. These reports served two purposes. They honored the memory of April while encouraging anyone with relevant information to contact investigators, even if many years had passed. Experience has shown that time can alter witness willingness to cooperate. Relationships change, loyalties shift, and individuals sometimes become more willing to share information they previously withheld. Detectives therefore continued accepting and evaluating new tips regardless of how much time had elapsed since the crime. The emotional impact of the investigation extended beyond law enforcement. April's family continued advocating for justice while living with decades of uncertainty. Community members who had participated in search efforts during 1988 remained aware that the case had never been resolved. For many residents of Fort Wayne, April's murder represented more than an unsolved investigation. It had become part of the community's history. Behind the scenes, forensic science continued advancing at an extraordinary pace. Laboratories achieved increasing sensitivity in DNA analysis, allowing profiles to be developed from evidence once considered unsuitable for testing. Improvements in instrumentation, statistical interpretation, and quality assurance strengthened confidence in forensic conclusions presented within the criminal justice system. Investigators monitored these developments carefully. Each scientific advancement created another opportunity to reconsider preserved evidence. Rather than viewing the passage of time as an obstacle, detectives increasingly recognized that time itself could become an investigative advantage if technological progress outpaced the limitations that had originally prevented identification. The importance of meticulous evidence preservation became even more apparent. Chain of custody records ensured investigators knew exactly where each exhibit had been stored and how it had been handled. Such documentation proved essential whenever evidence underwent renewed laboratory examination years after its original collection. By the middle of the decade, cold case investigations nationwide were beginning to demonstrate the value of combining historical evidence with modern forensic technique. Across the United States, older homicide investigations previously considered unsolvable were producing arrests through improved DNA testing. Although these developments did not immediately solve April Tinsley's murder, they reinforced investigators' belief that scientific progress remained their strongest path toward identifying the offender. Nevertheless, frustration persisted. Every unsuccessful forensic comparison, every eliminated lead, and every anniversary without an arrest reminded investigators that the central question remained unanswered. The preserved evidence clearly indicated that someone had committed the crime. The challenge lay in connecting that evidence to a specific individual. Importantly, investigators resisted the temptation to pursue unsupported theories. Public speculation occasionally identified possible suspects, but law enforcement consistently relied on documented evidence rather than rumors. Maintaining investigative discipline was particularly important in a case that had attracted significant public attention over many years. As the first decade of the 21st century progressed, detectives recognized that conventional investigative methods had likely reached their practical limits. Witness memories continued to fade, many original investigators had retired, and existing forensic database searches had not identified the offender. Yet optimism remained because another transformation in forensic science was quietly emerging, one that would eventually change cold case investigations across the United States. Researchers were beginning to explore methods of using DNA not simply to compare crime scene evidence against known offenders, but to identify previously unknown individuals through family relationship. At the time, these ideas remained largely experimental within criminal investigation. Few could predict how dramatically they would reshape cold case investigations during the following decade. For the April Tinsley investigation, the early 2000s therefore represented a period of preparation rather than resolution. Detectives continued preserving evidence, reviewing investigative files, consulting forensic experts, and monitoring scientific developments. They had not yet identified the person responsible, but they had ensured that when the next major breakthrough in forensic science arrived, the evidence collected in 1988 would still be available to tell its story. That careful stewardship would ultimately prove decisive in transforming one of Indiana's longest-running cold cases into a landmark example of how modern forensic science can finally answer questions that once seemed destined to remain forever unresolved. As the first decade of the 21st century progressed, the April Tinsley homicide investigation stood at an unusual crossroad. More than 20 years had passed since the murder of the 8-year-old Fort Wayne girl, yet the case remained active. Detectives no longer expected that a single eyewitness or spontaneous confession would solve the investigation. Instead, their greatest source of optimism lay inside carefully preserved evidence collected in April 1988. Evidence that had survived decades because investigators believed science would eventually become more powerful than it had been on the day the crime occurred. Cold cases often succeed or fail based on decisions made during the original investigation. In April Tinsley's case, crime scene personnel documented evidence meticulously, maintained chain of custody records, and preserved biological material according to accepted forensic standards of the time. Those procedures may have appeared routine in 1988, but they became increasingly significant as DNA technology evolved during the following decade. Throughout the 1990s and into the early 2000s, forensic laboratories made steady improvements in DNA profiling. Polymerase chain reaction, PCR, techniques became more sensitive, allowing analysts to work with smaller biological samples than had previously been possible. Short tandem repeat, STR, analysis gradually became the standard method for forensic DNA profiling in the United States, providing greater discriminatory power and more reliable comparisons between crime scene evidence and known individuals. These scientific developments prompted investigators to periodically review the April Tinsley evidence. Detectives consulted forensic scientists to determine whether newly available laboratory techniques could generate additional information from preserved biological material. Such reviews were deliberate and carefully documented because forensic testing can consume portions of finite evidence. The investigative team therefore sought to maximize scientific value while preserving material for future technologies that might prove even more informative. One of the principal investigative tools available during this period was the Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, developed to facilitate the comparison of forensic DNA profiles with profiles obtained from convicted offenders and other qualifying sources. CODIS represented a major advancement in criminal investigation. Detectives submitted suitable DNA profiles for comparison whenever laboratory standards permitted. Despite these efforts, no identifying match emerged. Publicly available records indicate that the forensic profile developed from evidence in the April Tinsley investigation did not initially correspond to any qualifying individual contained within CODIS. While disappointing, this result was not unusual. CODIS can only identify someone whose DNA profile has already been entered into the database through legally authorized collection procedures. If an offender has never provided a qualifying sample, the system cannot produce an identification. Rather than viewing the lack of a match as the end of the investigation, detectives interpreted it as an indication that the offender had simply not yet entered the available forensic databases. Consequently, the case remained open, with investigators continuing to preserve evidence and monitor developments in forensic science. At the same time, traditional investigative methods continued alongside laboratory work. Detectives revisited original reports prepared in 1988, examining interview transcripts, search records, maps, photographs, and evidence inventories. Modern case review techniques often encourage investigators unfamiliar with the original inquiry to reassess long-standing assumptions. Fresh perspectives can occasionally identify overlooked investigative opportunities, even when no new physical evidence exists. Successive generations of detectives inherited responsibility for the investigation. Personnel changes are inevitable in long-running cases. Officers retire, transfer assignments, or assume supervisory positions. Comprehensive documentation ensured that institutional knowledge did not disappear with individual investigators. Detailed reports allowed newly assigned detectives to understand why earlier decisions had been made, which leads had been eliminated, and what evidence remained available for future examination. The preservation of witness information also remained important. Although memories naturally diminish over time, investigators periodically recontacted individuals connected to the original investigation whenever new developments warranted additional interviews. Witnesses who had been children in 1988 were now adults. Neighbors had relocated, families had changed, and life circumstances had evolved. Detectives recognized that individuals sometimes become willing to share information years later that they had previously considered insignificant or were reluctant to disclose. Advances in digital record-keeping further enhanced investigative review. Earlier case files maintained primarily on paper could now be organized electronically, allowing detectives to cross-reference names, addresses, vehicle registrations, employment records, and criminal histories more efficiently than had been possible during the original investigation. Although technology improved the speed of analysis, investigators remained careful to distinguish documented facts from speculation. Throughout this period, April Tinsley's murder continued to receive periodic media attention, particularly on significant anniversaries. Local newspapers and television stations revisited the case, emphasizing that investigators had never stopped pursuing leads. Such coverage served an investigative purpose beyond public awareness. Experience has demonstrated that renewed media attention can generate new tips, encourage reluctant witnesses to come forward, or remind individuals of details they had previously forgotten. Law enforcement agencies consistently encouraged anyone possessing information, regardless of how minor it might appear, to contact investigators. Detectives understood that cold cases are occasionally solved because of seemingly insignificant observations that gain importance when combined with physical evidence developed years later. Meanwhile, forensic science continued advancing beyond traditional DNA profiling. Researchers improved methods for extracting usable genetic material from degraded or limited biological samples. Laboratory contamination controls became more sophisticated, statistical interpretation methods grew increasingly robust, and national quality assurance standards strengthened confidence in forensic conclusions presented during criminal proceedings. These developments reinforced the importance of preserving every available exhibit from the April Tinsley investigation. Evidence storage protocols ensured biological material remained suitable for future examination whenever new technologies became available. Chain of custody documentation verified the integrity of every item retained within law enforcement custody, preserving its admissibility should the investigation eventually result in prosecution. By the late 2000s, cold case investigations nationwide increasingly demonstrated that patience combined with scientific progress could overcome obstacles once considered insurmountable. Across the United States, numerous unsolved homicides from previous decades were being resolved through improved DNA testing. These successes provided encouragement to investigators working the April Tinsley case, even though their own investigation had not yet reached a breakthrough. Importantly, detectives avoided relying exclusively upon technology. Forensic evidence remains one component of a comprehensive criminal investigation. Once a potential suspect is identified through scientific means, investigators must still establish corroborating evidence, verify timelines, conduct interviews, and prepare a legally sustainable case for prosecution. Consequently, traditional investigative work continued alongside forensic review. Within Indiana, April Tinsley's murder remained a prominent example of the enduring commitment required in cold case investigations. Detectives repeatedly emphasized that the passage of time did not diminish the importance of solving the crime. Advances in science had fundamentally altered investigative expectations. Cases once believed permanently unsolved increasingly appeared capable of resolution if evidence had been preserved properly. By the end of the decade, investigators recognized that another significant transformation in forensic science was beginning to emerge. Researchers were exploring techniques capable of identifying unknown individuals through biological relationships rather than direct database matches. At that time, these approaches remained largely experimental within criminal investigations and had not yet become widely adopted by law enforcement agencies. Nevertheless, the underlying scientific principles suggested possibilities far beyond the capabilities of conventional forensic databases. The April Tinsley investigation was uniquely positioned to benefit from future developments because of the quality of its preserved evidence. Detectives had maintained biological material, documented investigative procedures comprehensively, and resisted discarding evidence that earlier generations might have considered exhausting. Those decisions reflected remarkable foresight rather than certainty. No investigator could predict precisely how forensic science would evolve, but preserving evidence ensured that future opportunities would remain available. As the investigation approached its third decade, the central facts remained unchanged. April Tinsley had disappeared while walking to visit friends on April 1st. Still 1988, she was found deceased the following day in rural DeKalb County. Extensive traditional investigation had not identified the offender, and early DNA database searches had produced no match. Yet the case had not reached its end. Instead, it had quietly entered a new era in which emerging scientific methods promised possibilities unimaginable when the crime first occurred. The investigation now rested upon a combination of patience, evidence preservation, and scientific progress. Detectives could not yet identify the person responsible, but they had ensured that every meaningful opportunity remained available. Unknown to everyone involved, the technological breakthrough that would ultimately transform the case was approaching not through a witness or a confession, but through an entirely new way of interpreting human DNA that would soon redefine cold case investigations throughout the United States. By the early 2010s, more than 2 decades had passed since the murder of April Tinsley. What had begun as an intensive local homicide investigation had evolved into one of Indiana's longest-running cold cases. Detectives who had worked the original investigation had largely retired, but the case itself had not faded from law enforcement's attention. New investigators inherited thousands of pages of reports, carefully preserved physical evidence, and a shared belief that advances in forensic science might eventually accomplish what conventional investigative methods had not. The physical evidence collected in 1988 remained the foundation of the investigation. Biological material recovered during the original inquiry had been preserved under controlled conditions, allowing forensic laboratories to revisit the evidence as analytical techniques continued to improve. Over the years, investigators repeatedly consulted forensic specialists to determine whether additional testing could yield new information without compromising the remaining sample. During this period, DNA profiling had become a routine component of criminal investigations across the United States. Laboratory methods were faster, more sensitive, and capable of producing reliable genetic profiles from much smaller quantities of biological material than had been possible 2 decades earlier. Crime laboratories also benefited from increasingly sophisticated quality assurance standards, ensuring that DNA evidence could withstand close scrutiny in court. Despite these advances, the April Tinsley investigation remained unresolved. Detectives had developed a forensic DNA profile suitable for comparison, and searches of the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, had been conducted. Publicly available information indicates that those comparisons did not identify the offender. The absence of a match suggested a straightforward possibility. The person responsible was not represented in the database under the legal criteria that existed at the time. This limitation highlighted an important reality about CODIS. The system is exceptionally effective when the offender's DNA profile has already been entered through a qualifying criminal conviction or other authorized collection. However, CODIS cannot identify individuals whose DNA has never been submitted. For investigators working older homicide cases, this meant that many crimes could remain unsolved despite the presence of a high-quality forensic DNA profile. Rather than abandoning hope, forensic scientists and investigators across the country began exploring new approaches. One emerging field attracted particular attention: investigative genetic genealogy. Unlike traditional forensic database searches, investigative genetic genealogy does not depend upon finding the exact offender within a law enforcement database. Instead, under appropriate legal and investigative frameworks, analysts compare crime scene DNA with profiles voluntarily uploaded by individuals to certain public genealogy services that permit law enforcement use. Rather than producing an exact match, these comparisons may identify biological relatives of the unknown contributor. Genealogists can then construct family trees, gradually narrowing the pool of potential individuals through documented family relationships, historical records, geographic information, age, and other investigative evidence. When this concept first emerged, it represented a significant shift in criminal investigation. The science behind DNA comparison was well established, but using distant familial relationships to identify an unknown suspect required a combination of forensic biology, genealogy, historical research, and traditional detective work. The approach was promising, but it remained relatively new and had not yet been widely adopted. Investigators assigned to long unsolved cases, including the April Tinsley homicide, monitored these developments carefully. They recognized that genetic genealogy might eventually provide an avenue unavailable through conventional forensic databases. However, successful application required suitable DNA evidence, specialized expertise, and substantial genealogical research. At the same time, detectives continued performing the less visible work that sustains cold case investigations. Evidence inventories were reviewed. Chain of custody records remained current. Original investigative files were digitized where appropriate, making decades of documentation more accessible to newly assigned investigators. Witness statements, crime scene photographs, laboratory reports, and prior investigative memoranda remained available for future review. Cold case investigations depend heavily upon continuity. Even when scientific breakthroughs occur, investigators must understand the historical context of the evidence they are examining. The meticulous documentation maintained throughout the April Tinsley investigation ensured that new forensic findings could be interpreted alongside the extensive investigative work completed since 1988. Law enforcement also maintained regular communication with April's family, who had spent decades waiting for answers. Public statements from investigators consistently emphasized that the case remained active. Although specific investigative details were rarely disclosed, officials reiterated that preserved evidence continued to be evaluated using the best available scientific method. Nationally, the landscape of cold case investigations was changing. Across the United States, improved forensic testing led to the resolution of numerous older homicide cases. Some investigations succeeded because of more sensitive DNA analysis. Others benefited from expanded forensic databases or renewed witness cooperation. Each solved case reinforced confidence that evidence preserved decades earlier could still produce meaningful results. The April Tinsley investigation shared many characteristics with these cases. Detectives possessed preserved biological evidence, comprehensive investigative documentation, and an enduring commitment to identifying the offender. What remained missing was the scientific mechanism capable of connecting the unknown DNA profile to a specific individual. As investigative genetic genealogy matured, researchers refined methods for constructing family trees based on distant genetic relationships. Public records, including birth certificates, marriage records, census information, obituaries, and other genealogical sources, became valuable tools in narrowing possible identities. This work required extraordinary patience. Analysts might begin with distant relatives sharing only small amounts of DNA and gradually reconstruct multiple generations of family history before investigators could identify viable candidates. Importantly, genetic genealogy does not itself establish criminal responsibility. Instead, it generates investigative leads. Once a potential suspect is identified, detectives must independently corroborate that lead through traditional investigative method. Additional evidence, including legally obtained DNA samples, documented timelines, interviews, and forensic comparisons, is necessary before any criminal charge can be considered. By the mid-2010s, law enforcement agencies were increasingly recognizing the potential value of this approach for selected cold cases involving preserved DNA evidence. The methodology remained resource-intensive and required careful legal and ethical oversight, but early successes demonstrated that crimes once considered unsolvable might now be approached from an entirely new direction. Investigators working the April Tinsley case evaluated these developments with growing interest. The biological evidence preserved since 1988 appeared suitable for advanced analysis, and the case met many of the criteria that had made other long unsolved investigations appropriate candidates for emerging genealogical technique. Throughout this period, detectives continued emphasizing the importance of evidence integrity. Every transfer of physical evidence was documented. Laboratory analyses followed established forensic protocol. Investigators understood that any future prosecution would depend not only on scientific identification, but also on demonstrating that evidence had been preserved, handled, and analyzed according to accepted legal standards over the course of decades. The patience displayed throughout the investigation was becoming increasingly significant. Decisions made by investigators in 1988 to preserve biological evidence carefully document investigative procedures thoroughly and maintain comprehensive records had created opportunities that could not have been anticipated at the time. Without that foundation, later scientific advances would have offered little practical value. By the latter half of the decade, the investigation had reached a pivotal moment. Traditional investigative methods had been exhausted, code searches had not identified the offender, and witness memories had inevitably faded. Yet investigators now possess something unavailable to earlier generations: an emerging scientific technique capable of identifying an unknown individual through biological relatives rather than direct database matching. The April Tinsley case stood ready to enter that new phase. Detectives had preserved the evidence, forensic scientists had expanded the limits of DNA analysis, and investigative genetic genealogy was beginning to demonstrate its remarkable potential in carefully selected cold cases. For nearly 30 years, the investigation had depended upon the hope that science would eventually catch up with the evidence collected in 1988. That hope was no longer theoretical. The tools investigators had been waiting for were finally becoming available, setting the stage for the breakthrough that would ultimately transform one of Indiana's most enduring cold cases from an unsolved mystery into a case approaching identification through the combined power of forensic science, genealogy, and decades of patient investigative work. By 2017, nearly 3 decades had passed since the murder of April Tinsley. For almost 30 years, the investigation had followed every path available through conventional police work. Detectives had interviewed hundreds of witnesses, collected and preserved physical evidence, consulted forensic laboratories as technology advanced, and repeatedly searched national DNA databases without identifying the offender. The case remained open, but investigators increasingly recognized that any future breakthrough would likely come not from a new eyewitness, but from a scientific method that had only recently become available. One of the most significant developments in forensic investigations during the late 2010s was the emergence of investigative genetic genealogy. Unlike traditional DNA database comparisons, which require an exact match between crime scene DNA and a profile already contained within a law enforcement database, genetic genealogy uses shared DNA between biological relatives to generate investigative leads. With appropriate legal authority and within the policies governing participating genealogy services, investigators can compare an unknown DNA profile against voluntarily submitted profiles to identify potential relatives. From there, genealogists reconstruct family relationships using historical records and conventional investigative techniques. At the time, this methodology was still relatively new. It required collaboration between forensic scientists, genealogists, prosecutors, and experienced detectives. Importantly, the process did not identify a suspect by itself. Instead, it narrowed an unknown person's possible identity through documented family connections, after which investigators had to verify the lead through independent evidence. The April Tinsley investigation was well positioned to benefit from this approach because of the quality of the biological evidence preserved since 1988. Investigators determined that the DNA profile developed from the evidence could be suitable for advanced genealogical analysis. This decision reflected decades of careful evidence preservation and the continued commitment of successive investigative teams who had ensured that the material remained available for future scientific examination. Specialists began the painstaking process of analyzing the unknown DNA profile. Unlike the rapid comparisons performed through CODIS, genetic genealogy often involves extensive historical research. Analysts identify individuals who share portions of DNA with the unknown contributor, then build family trees using publicly available genealogical records, including birth records, marriage records, census information, obituaries, and other historical documents. This process can require months of detailed research. A distant genetic match may share only a small amount of DNA with the unknown individual, meaning investigators must trace multiple generations of family relationships before narrowing the list of possible candidates. Every branch of a family tree must be verified through documentary evidence rather than assumption. As genealogical analysis progressed, investigators gradually reduced the number of individuals who could plausibly have contributed the DNA recovered during the April Tinsley investigation. The analysis did not immediately identify a single person, but it provided detectives with a manageable group of related individuals whose documented family histories warranted further investigation. Traditional detective work then became essential. Investigators compared genealogical findings with known facts established during the original investigation. They considered geography, age, historical residences, employment records, and other documented information. Individuals who could not have been responsible based on verified timelines or locations were eliminated. Others remained under closer review. Eventually, investigators identified one individual whose documented background was consistent with the available evidence. Public court records later identified that individual as John Miller, who had lived in the Fort Wayne area at the time of April Tinsley's murder. At this stage, however, investigators treated him as an investigative lead rather than a confirmed offender. Genetic genealogy had pointed detectives toward a possible identity, but independent confirmation remained legally and scientifically necessary. The next step required obtaining a DNA sample suitable for comparison with the forensic evidence collected in 1988. Rather than immediately seeking an arrest, investigators initiated discreet surveillance. Such surveillance serves several purposes in major investigations. It allows detectives to confirm a suspect's identity, observe routine activities, and lawfully obtain abandoned items that may contain biological material suitable for DNA testing. This practice is well established in criminal investigations and helps preserve the integrity of subsequent forensic comparison. According to publicly documented court records, investigators collected items that John D. Miller had discarded in public, allowing forensic laboratories to recover DNA without directly confronting him. These items were submitted for laboratory analysis using established forensic procedures. Scientists then compared the recovered DNA profile with the profile developed from biological evidence preserved since 1988. The results proved decisive. Laboratory testing concluded that the DNA obtained during surveillance was consistent with the forensic DNA profile recovered during the original homicide investigation. This comparison provided the scientific confirmation investigators had sought for nearly 30 years. The evidence that had remained silent through decades of technological limitation could now be interpreted with a level of certainty unavailable to investigators in 1988. Even after receiving the laboratory results, detectives proceeded cautiously. Major homicide investigations require corroboration beyond a single scientific finding. Investigators reviewed historical records, examined prior investigative files, verified timelines, and coordinated with prosecutors to ensure that every step of the investigation complied with legal requirements. Only after completing this process did law enforcement prepare to move forward with an arrest. For many investigators, the moment represented the culmination of work extending across multiple careers. Detectives who had originally worked the case in 1988 had long since retired. Others had inherited responsibility years later, preserving evidence and reviewing investigative files without knowing whether science would ever provide an answer. The breakthrough belonged not to a single detective, but to generations of investigators, forensic scientists, laboratory personnel, evidence custodians, and prosecutors who had collectively maintained the integrity of the case over nearly 3 decades. The investigation also demonstrated an important principle increasingly recognized within forensic science. Carefully preserved evidence can retain extraordinary value even after many years. Decisions made at the original crime scene regarding documentation, biological evidence collection, packaging, and storage ultimately made advanced DNA analysis possible decades later. Throughout this period, law enforcement remained mindful of the emotional significance of the investigation for April Tinsley's family. Public statements emphasized that the scientific breakthrough resulted from years of patient investigative work rather than a sudden discovery. Officials acknowledged the contributions of earlier investigators whose commitment to evidence preservation had created the opportunity for modern forensic science to succeed. The use of investigative genetic genealogy in the April Tinsley case also attracted national attention because it illustrated the growing role of this methodology in resolving long unsolved violent crime. Although each investigation presents unique legal and scientific considerations, the case demonstrated how genealogical analysis could complement, not replace, traditional police work. Genealogy generated the lead, surveillance, forensic testing, and conventional investigation confirmed it. By the time investigators completed their review, the April Tinsley homicide investigation had undergone a remarkable transformation. For nearly 30 years, detectives had possessed an unidentified DNA profile without knowing the name of the individual who left it. Through the combined application of advanced forensic genetics, genealogical research, and meticulous investigative follow-up, that anonymous profile had finally been connected to a specific person. The breakthrough did not erase the decades during which April's family had waited for answers, nor did it diminish the profound loss suffered in 1988. What it did accomplish was something investigators had pursued since the first days of the investigation. It converted preserved forensic evidence into an identified investigative suspect through methods grounded in documented science and careful police work. The case now stood at the threshold of its final phase. After almost 30 years as one of Indiana's most enduring cold cases, investigators were preparing to confront the man they believed the evidence had identified. The next steps would move the investigation from scientific discovery to the criminal justice process, where decades of preserved evidence, modern forensic analysis, and traditional investigative work would ultimately be presented before a court. By July 2018, nearly 30 years after the murder of April Tinsley, investigators had reached a point that had once seemed almost unimaginable. After decades of reviewing evidence, preserving biological material, revisiting witness statements, and embracing new forensic technologies, law enforcement believed they had identified the person responsible for the crime. The investigation that had begun in April 1988 was about to move from the realm of cold case investigation into the criminal justice system. On July 15, 2018, investigators arrested John D. Miller, a resident of Allen County, Indiana. The arrest followed months of investigative work involving forensic DNA analysis, investigative genetic genealogy surveillance, and laboratory confirmation. Law enforcement emphasized that the arrest was not based on a single piece of evidence alone. Rather, it reflected the cumulative results of decades of investigation combined with modern forensic science. Following the arrest, authorities announced that DNA evidence had played the central role in identifying the suspect. Investigators explained that advances in forensic technology had allowed them to use preserved biological evidence collected in 1988 in ways that had not been possible at the time of the crime. The careful preservation of that evidence ultimately made the identification possible. The announcement attracted national attention. By 2018, investigative genetic genealogy had already begun transforming several high-profile cold case investigations across the United States. The April Tinsley case became another prominent example of how emerging forensic methods could identify suspects decades after crimes had occurred. Law enforcement officials acknowledged the contributions of numerous agencies and forensic specialists who had worked on the investigation over the course of 3 decades. Detectives who had originally responded to the case in 1988, evidence technicians who had preserved critical exhibits, laboratory scientists who had repeatedly re-examined biological evidence, and prosecutors who had guided the legal process all played important roles in bringing the investigation to this stage. After his arrest, John D. Miller was formally charged in connection with April Tinsley's murder. Under the American criminal justice system, every defendant is presumed innocent unless proven guilty in court. Accordingly, investigators continued preparing evidence for judicial proceedings while prosecutors assembled the case for presentation before the court. One of the prosecution's most significant pieces of evidence involved forensic DNA analysis. According to publicly available court records, laboratory comparisons concluded that the DNA obtained during the investigation was consistent with the biological evidence recovered during the original homicide investigation. These scientific findings formed a critical component of the prosecution's case. In addition to DNA evidence, investigators relied upon the extensive documentation accumulated since 1988, original crime scene records, laboratory reports, chain of custody documentation, witness interviews, and evidence preservation records demonstrated how physical evidence had been collected, stored, and analyzed throughout the decade. Such documentation is essential in long-running investigations because it establishes the reliability and integrity of forensic evidence presented in court. The case also highlighted the importance of maintaining an unbroken chain of custody. Every transfer of physical evidence from the original crime scene to forensic laboratories and long-term evidence storage had been documented. These records allowed prosecutors to demonstrate that the biological evidence introduced during judicial proceedings remained the same material collected during the original investigation. Investigators further explained the role of investigative genetic genealogy during the inquiry. Importantly, genealogy itself was not presented as proof of guilt. Instead, it served as an investigative tool that directed detectives toward a potential suspect. The subsequent DNA comparison obtained through lawful investigative methods provided the independent forensic evidence supporting the prosecution. As legal proceedings continued, prosecutors emphasized that modern forensic science had finally answered questions that investigators had been unable to resolve in 1988. The case illustrated how preserved evidence could retain evidentiary value for decades when properly collected and maintained. During the course of the proceedings, the court also considered statements made by the defendant following his arrest. According to publicly reported court records, Miller admitted responsibility for the murder during police interviews after being advised of his legal right. Such statements became part of the evidence considered during the prosecution, alongside the extensive forensic findings developed throughout the investigation. The admission did not diminish the importance of the DNA evidence. Rather, the confession and the forensic analysis reinforced one another. Modern criminal investigations routinely rely upon multiple independent sources of evidence whenever possible. DNA evidence, documented investigative history, and post-arrest statements collectively strengthen the prosecution's case. For April Tinsley's family, the arrest marked the end of nearly 3 decades of uncertainty. Although no judicial proceeding could undo the events of April 1988, the identification of a suspect answered the central question that had remained unresolved for 30 years. Who was responsible? The case also resonated deeply within the Fort Wayne community. Many residents who remembered participating in search efforts or following the investigation through local news reports expressed relief that the case had finally reached a significant milestone. Others reflected on how profoundly the murder had influenced community attitudes toward child safety during the late 1980s and beyond. Within law enforcement, the successful resolution of the case reinforced several enduring investigative principles. First, evidence preservation remains essential. Decisions made during the initial investigation directly affect the possibility of future forensic testing. Second, technological limitations at one point in time do not necessarily represent permanent barriers. Scientific advances may eventually provide capabilities unavailable to earlier investigators. Third, comprehensive investigative documentation allows future detectives to build upon prior work rather than repeating it. The April Tinsley investigation became an important case study within the broader field of cold case investigation. Training programs, forensic conferences, and law enforcement agencies frequently cited the investigation as an example of how traditional detective work and emerging forensic technologies can complement one another. Genetic genealogy generated the investigative lead, but conventional police procedures, including surveillance, evidence collection, laboratory confirmation, interviews, and prosecution remained indispensable. Legal proceedings ultimately concluded when John D. Miller pleaded guilty to the murder of April Tinsley in 2018, avoiding the need for a full trial. During sentencing, the court imposed a sentence of 80 years in prison, reflecting the seriousness of the offense under Indiana law. The guilty plea brought the criminal proceedings to a conclusion while sparing April's family the necessity of reliving every aspect of the crime during a lengthy jury trial. The resolution of the case represented not only justice for one family but also a milestone in forensic investigation. It demonstrated how decades of patient evidence preservation, scientific advancement, and persistent investigative effort could ultimately overcome the passage of time. Looking back, investigators often noted that the evidence had been present from the very beginning. What had changed over the years was not the evidence itself, but humanity's ability to interpret it. Biological material collected in 1988 remains scientifically meaningful 30 years later because investigators had preserved it carefully and because forensic science had evolved dramatically during the intervening decades. The April Tinsley case ultimately became one of Indiana's best-known examples of a cold case solved through modern forensic technique. It underscored the importance of maintaining unsolved investigations, investing in forensic science, and recognizing that justice may still be achievable even after many years. The investigation that had begun with the disappearance of an 8-year-old girl on an ordinary spring afternoon had finally reached a legal conclusion. Yet its broader legacy extended far beyond a single conviction. It influenced the future of cold case investigations across the United States, demonstrating that careful police work, scientific innovation, and persistence could succeed together where earlier generations had been limited by the technology of their time. The resolution of the April Tinsley case in 2018 marked the end of one criminal investigation, but it also became the beginning of a broader conversation within American law enforcement. Detectives, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and policymakers viewed the case not simply as the successful identification of a suspect after 3 decades, but as a demonstration of how modern investigative methods could fundamentally change the future of cold case investigation. The lessons learned from April Tinsley's case extended far beyond Indiana, influencing how agencies across the United States approached unsolved, violent crime. One of the most significant lessons concerned the importance of evidence preservation. Every homicide investigation produces physical evidence, but the long-term value of that evidence depends upon how carefully it is collected, documented, packaged, and stored. In April Tinsley's case, investigators in 1988 preserved biological evidence even though the available forensic technology could not fully exploit it at the time. Their decision reflected sound investigative practice rather than knowledge of future scientific breakthrough. By 2018, those preserved samples became the foundation of an entirely new investigative strategy. Had the evidence deteriorated, been contaminated, or been discarded, later advances in DNA analysis and investigative genetic genealogy would have had little practical value. Consequently, the case became an important teaching example for evidence technicians and homicide investigators throughout the country. Law enforcement training programs increasingly emphasized that evidence collected today may ultimately be examined using technologies that do not yet exist. This philosophy encourages investigators to treat every major crime seen as a potential future cold case, ensuring that biological material, trace evidence, digital records, and documentation remain suitable for long-term preservation. The investigation also demonstrated the value of meticulous documentation. Throughout the 30-year inquiry, detectives maintained extensive records detailing witness interviews, laboratory examinations, search warrants, evidence transfer, investigative decisions, and forensic analyses. Such documentation allowed successive generations of investigators to understand precisely what had occurred during earlier phases of the investigation. Personnel changes are inevitable in long-running investigations. Detectives retire, supervisors change assignments, and prosecutors move to different positions. Comprehensive documentation prevents institutional knowledge from disappearing with individual investigators. In the April Tinsley case, newly assigned detectives inherited a well-organized investigative record that enabled them to continue the inquiry without repeating work already completed decades earlier. Another important lesson involved the relationship between traditional investigative methods and emerging forensic science. Public attention often focused on investigative genetic genealogy because of its innovative role in identifying the suspect. However, law enforcement officials consistently emphasized that genealogy did not solve the case independently. Genetic genealogy generated an investigative lead. Detectives then verified that lead through conventional police work, including surveillance, lawful evidence collection, laboratory DNA comparison, investigative interviews, and prosecutorial review. This sequence illustrated an important principle within modern criminal investigation. Advanced technology complements traditional detective work rather than replacing it. The case also highlighted the evolving role of DNA within the criminal justice system. During the late 1980s, DNA analysis was still emerging as a forensic discipline. Laboratories faced technical limitations regarding sample quantity, processing speed, and analytical sensitivity. Over the following 3 decades, improvements in polymerase chain reaction techniques, short tandem repeat analysis, contamination control, and statistical interpretation transformed DNA into one of the most powerful forms of forensic evidence available. April Tinsley's investigation reflected that scientific evolution, the biological evidence itself, did not change between 1988 and 2018. Instead, laboratory capabilities improved dramatically, allowing scientists to obtain information that had always been contained within the preserved evidence but could not previously be interpreted. The case likewise contributed to ongoing discussions regarding investigative genetic genealogy, because this investigative method involves comparing crime scene DNA with profiles voluntarily submitted to certain genealogy databases under applicable legal and policy frameworks. It raises important questions concerning privacy, informed consent, and responsible investigative use. Following several successful cold case investigations nationwide, many agencies developed formal policies governing when investigative genetic genealogy may be considered appropriate. Typically, these policies emphasize serious violent crimes, judicial oversight where required, careful legal review, and the use of genealogy as an investigative led rather than independent proof of criminal responsibility. The April Tinsley investigation became one of several prominent cases demonstrating both the effectiveness and the limitations of this emerging methodology. Investigators consistently explained that genealogical analysis merely narrowed the field of potential individuals. Independent forensic confirmation remained essential before any criminal charges could proceed. For April Tinsley's family, the investigation's conclusion represented justice after decades of uncertainty. Although the passage of time could never erase the loss experienced in 1988, the identification, prosecution, and conviction of the offender provided answers that had remained unavailable for nearly 30 years. Throughout the investigation, family members continued cooperating with law enforcement and supporting efforts to preserve public awareness of the case. The Fort Wayne community also experienced a sense of resolution. Many residents vividly remembered the search efforts following April's disappearance, the widespread fear that followed her murder, and the years during which the investigation remained unsolved. The eventual resolution reminded the community that cold cases are not abandoned simply because time has passed. Within Indiana law enforcement, the case reinforced the importance of maintaining active cold case review programs. Periodic reassessment of unsolved homicides allows investigators to apply new scientific methods, review historical evidence, and evaluate investigative strategies in light of technological advances. Many successful cold case investigations result not from a single dramatic discovery, but from sustained institutional commitment over many years. The investigation also illustrated the importance of collaboration. Solving the case required the combined efforts of local police departments, state agencies, forensic laboratories, prosecutors, genealogists, evidence technicians, and investigative specialists. Each discipline contributed unique expertise while remaining focused on a common objective. Another lasting contribution of the case involved public understanding of forensic science. Media coverage surrounding the investigation introduced many people to concepts such as DNA profiling, evidence preservation, and investigative genetic genealogy. While public reporting sometimes simplified complex scientific processes, the investigation nonetheless demonstrated how careful scientific analysis can assist criminal investigations without replacing traditional evidentiary standards. For forensic scientists, the case reinforced confidence in long-term evidence preservation. Biological samples collected decades earlier remained suitable for sophisticated laboratory analysis because investigators had maintained appropriate storage conditions and documented chain of custody procedures. These practices continue to serve as fundamental principles within modern forensic laboratories. The case further illustrated that technological progress often benefits investigations incrementally rather than instantaneously. Investigators did not solve the murder through a single new invention. Instead, successive improvements in DNA extraction, amplification, profiling, database comparison, genealogical research, and laboratory interpretation collectively created capabilities unavailable to investigators in 1988. Looking back across the full timeline of the investigation, each generation of detectives contributed essential work. The original investigators secured the crime scene, interviewed witnesses, and preserved evidence. Successive detectives maintained the investigation, reviewed new leads, monitored scientific developments, and ensured the integrity of the evidence. The investigators who ultimately identified the suspect built directly upon that foundation rather than replacing it. The April Tinsley investigation therefore became more than a successfully solved homicide. It represented a case study in perseverance, scientific advancement, and institutional continuity. It demonstrated that justice delayed need not become justice denied when evidence is preserved, investigative records are maintained, and law enforcement remains willing to revisit unsolved cases as technology evolves. Today, the case continues to be referenced within discussions of forensic science, cold case investigation, and evidence management. It serves as a reminder that some of the most important decisions in a criminal investigation occur during the earliest hours after a crime, when investigators carefully collect and preserve evidence that may not reveal its full significance until decades later. Ultimately, the legacy of April Tinsley's case extends beyond the successful prosecution of one offender. It helped shape investigative practices, continue to influence homicide investigations across the United States. Through meticulous evidence preservation, evolving forensic science, and sustained investigative commitment, the case demonstrated that even after 30 years, carefully protected evidence can still speak with extraordinary clarity when science finally develops the ability to hear it. The resolution of the April Tinsley investigation in 2018 represented more than the successful conclusion of a 30-year homicide inquiry. It also illustrated how the field of forensic science had evolved between the late 1980s and the 21st century. Looking back over the investigation, one of the most striking observations is that the critical biological evidence existed from the very beginning. What changed over time was not the evidence itself, but the scientific tools available to examine it. When investigators processed the crime scene in April 1988, DNA profiling was still an emerging forensic discipline. The first criminal cases involving DNA evidence had only recently appeared in court, and many crime laboratories had limited experience with the technology. Laboratory procedures required relatively large biological samples. Processing times were lengthy, and forensic standards were still developing. Detectives recognized the potential value of biological evidence, but they could not fully anticipate how dramatically DNA science would advance during the following decades. Consequently, one of the most important decisions made during the original investigation involved preserving evidence rather than exhausting it through repeated testing using the limited methods available at the time. Biological samples were carefully collected, packaged, documented, and stored according to accepted forensic procedure. Chain of custody records documented every transfer of evidence between investigators, evidence custodians, and forensic laboratories. These practices reflected fundamental principles of criminal investigation. Evidence must remain protected not only from contamination, but also from unnecessary degradation. Proper storage conditions preserve biological material, allowing future scientific examination even many years after collection. In the April Tinsley investigation, this careful preservation ultimately allowed forensic scientists to apply technologies that had not yet been developed when the evidence first entered police custody. The scientific evolution of DNA analysis during the following 3 decades occurred in several stages. Early restriction fragment length polymorphism, RFLP methods gradually gave way to polymerase chain reaction, PCR, based techniques capable of amplifying much smaller biological samples. Subsequently, short tandem repeat, STR, analysis became the standard approach for forensic DNA profiling within accredited laboratories. These methods significantly increased both sensitivity and statistical reliability. Laboratory instrumentation also improved. Scientists became capable of developing usable DNA profiles from biological material that earlier generations of forensic analysts might have considered insufficient or degraded. Enhanced contamination controls, standardized laboratory procedures, and rigorous quality assurance protocols further strengthened confidence in forensic conclusions presented within criminal court. For investigators working cold cases, these scientific developments transformed long-preserved evidence into valuable investigative resources. Cases previously considered unsolvable because of technological limitations could now be re-evaluated using modern laboratory methods. The April Tinsley investigation exemplified this transformation. Detectives periodically submitted preserved evidence for additional forensic examination as laboratory capabilities advanced. Each new analytical method was considered carefully, balancing the possibility of obtaining additional information against the need to preserve finite biological material for future testing. These decisions required close collaboration between investigators and forensic scientists. Another important scientific development involved the expansion of forensic DNA databases. The Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, became a powerful investigative resource by allowing laboratories to compare forensic DNA profiles against profiles collected from qualifying offenders and other authorized sources. CODIS has solved thousands of criminal investigations by identifying individuals whose DNA already existed within the database. However, the April Tinsley investigation also demonstrated the limitations of traditional forensic databases. publicly documented information indicates that repeated Cody's comparisons did not identify the offender. This outcome did not suggest deficiencies within the system itself. Rather, it reflected a simple reality. Database searches cannot identify individuals whose DNA has never been entered into the database under applicable legal criteria. This limitation encouraged forensic scientists and investigators to explore alternative investigative approaches. Among the most significant developments was investigative genetic genealogy, which applies principles of human inheritance to generate investigative leads through biological relatives rather than direct offender database matching. Unlike CODIS, investigative genetic genealogy does not seek an exact correspondence between the unknown DNA profile and an existing offender profile. Instead, it identifies individuals who share measurable portions of DNA because of common ancestry. Genealogists then reconstruct documented family relationships using historical records such as birth certificates, marriage records, census information, obituaries, and other genealogical sources. Traditional detective work subsequently narrows the resulting family tree based upon geography, age, historical residence, and other documented investigative facts. The April Tinsley investigation illustrated the complementary relationship between genealogy and conventional police investigation. Genetic genealogy generated an investigative lead. Detectives independently corroborated that led through surveillance, lawful collection of discarded biological material, laboratory DNA comparison, and comprehensive prosecutorial review. At no point did genealogy itself constitute proof of criminal responsibility. Forensic scientists have frequently cited this distinction when explaining the role of genetic genealogy within criminal investigations. The methodology functions as an investigative tool rather than evidentiary proof. Final conclusions continue to rely upon independently verified forensic comparisons, properly documented evidence, and established legal standards. Another important scientific lesson from the case concerns evidence integrity. Throughout 3 decades of investigation, chain of custody documentation remained complete and continuous. Every movement of evidence was recorded, preserving confidence that laboratory analyses performed years later involved the same material collected during the original investigation. Such documentation remains essential whenever forensic evidence is presented during criminal proceedings. The case also emphasized interdisciplinary cooperation. Modern cold case investigations increasingly require expertise extending beyond traditional detective work. Forensic biologists, evidence technicians, genealogists, prosecutors, digital analysts, and laboratory quality assurance specialists all contributed specialized knowledge throughout the investigation. Effective communication among these disciplines proved essential to maintaining scientific and legal reliability. Within forensic laboratories, the April Tinsley investigation reinforced the value of maintaining high-quality evidence storage systems. Biological evidence may remain scientifically useful for decades when preserved under appropriate environmental conditions. Laboratory policies concerning temperature control, contamination prevention, packaging standards, and evidence tracking all contribute directly to future investigative opportunities. The investigation likewise highlighted the importance of continuing education within law enforcement. Detectives assigned to cold cases must remain informed regarding emerging forensic methodologies, evolving legal standards, and new investigative technology. Scientific advances occur continuously, and techniques considered experimental during one decade may become standard practice during the next. Beyond forensic science itself, the case contributed to broader discussions concerning resource allocation for cold case investigation. Maintaining evidence, conducting periodic reviews, consulting forensic specialists, and applying advanced laboratory techniques require sustained institutional commitment. The successful resolution of the April Tinsley investigation demonstrated that long-term investment in unsolved homicide investigations can produce meaningful results many years after the original crime. Importantly, investigators consistently avoided overstating the capabilities of forensic science. DNA evidence represents one component of a comprehensive criminal investigation. Scientific findings require proper interpretation, legal scrutiny, corroboration, and contextual understanding. Modern investigations remain strongest when forensic evidence is integrated with traditional investigative methods rather than viewed as a substitute for them. Looking back across the entire investigation, one conclusion becomes particularly clear. The evidence collected in 1988 possessed the potential to identify the offender from the moment it entered police custody. That potential remained unrealized for decades because available technology had not yet reached the necessary level of sophistication. Once science advanced sufficiently, investigators could finally extract information that had always existed within the preserved biological material. This observation continues to influence modern homicide investigations. Detectives now routinely recognize that evidence collected today may someday be examined using technologies not yet available. Consequently, preservation has become as important as immediate analysis. Properly collected evidence serves not only the investigation of the present, but also the possibilities of the future. The April Tinsley investigation therefore occupies an important place in the history of forensic science. It demonstrates that scientific progress can extend the reach of justice far beyond the technological limitations of an earlier era. More importantly, it reminds investigators that patience, careful documentation, evidence preservation, and rigorous scientific standards remain indispensable components of successful criminal investigation. Through the combined efforts of investigators, forensic scientists, and prosecutors across 3 decades, evidence that once appeared silent ultimately provided clear answers, confirming that the careful work performed at the very beginning of an investigation may one day become its most decisive contribution. The successful resolution of the April Tinsley case in 2018 prompted investigators across the United States to re-examine the broader question of how unsolved homicide investigations should be managed over long periods of time. For decades, cold cases had often been viewed as investigations waiting for a witness to come forward or for an unexpected confession. The April Tinsley investigation demonstrated that another pathway had become increasingly important: preserving evidence so that future scientific advances could answer questions that contemporary investigators could not. One of the clearest lessons from the investigation concerned the definition of a cold case. Within law enforcement, the term does not mean that investigators have abandoned an investigation. Rather, it generally refers to a case in which all immediately available investigative leads have been exhausted without identifying or prosecuting the responsible individual. Such cases remain open, and detectives continue reviewing them whenever new evidence, new technology, or credible information becomes available. The April Tinsley investigation reflected this principle throughout its 30-year history. Although public attention naturally declined after the initial investigation, detectives continued maintaining evidence, reviewing forensic developments, evaluating new information, and periodically reassessing investigative strategies. The case remained active even when no immediate breakthroughs appeared likely. The investigation also illustrated the importance of institutional continuity. Homicide investigations extending over several decades inevitably involve multiple generations of investigators. Detectives retire, supervisors change, prosecutors move to new assignments, and forensic laboratories adopt new technologies. Maintaining continuity requires comprehensive documentation that allows each successive investigator to understand the work completed by previous teams. In the April Tinsley case, original reports documented crime scene processing, witness interviews, laboratory analyses, search activities, and investigative decisions in considerable detail. These records enabled future detectives to build upon earlier work rather than repeating investigative steps unnecessarily. Cold case specialists frequently emphasize that thorough documentation represents one of the most valuable assets within any long-term investigation. Evidence preservation constituted another central lesson. Biological material collected during the original investigation remained scientifically valuable because investigators followed accepted procedures governing collection, packaging, storage, and chain of custody. Proper preservation allowed forensic scientists decades later to apply laboratory methods that did not exist when the evidence was originally recovered. This principle extends beyond biological evidence alone. Fingerprints, trace materials, photographs, maps, digital records, witness statements, and physical exhibits all possess potential long-term investigative value. Modern homicide investigations therefore emphasize comprehensive evidence management designed to preserve future opportunities for scientific analysis. The case likewise demonstrated the evolving relationship between forensic science and traditional detective work. Public discussion often focused upon DNA because of its central role in identifying the offender. However, investigators consistently noted that forensic evidence alone cannot complete a criminal investigation. Scientific analysis identifies biological relationships, develops investigative leads, or confirms associations between evidence and individuals. Detectives must then integrate those findings with witness interviews, documented timelines, surveillance, legal procedures, and prosecutorial review. Successful investigations depend upon the combined application of scientific expertise and conventional investigative method. The April Tinsley investigation also highlighted the significance of interagency cooperation. Local police departments, forensic laboratories, prosecutors, state agencies, and specialized investigative personnel contributed expertise throughout the investigation. Modern cold case investigations increasingly rely upon such multidisciplinary collaboration because no single organization typically possesses every necessary resource or area of specialization. Advances in forensic science during the late 20th and early 21st centuries fundamentally altered investigative expectations. Earlier generations of detectives often recognized that biological evidence might prove important without fully understanding how future technologies would analyze it. As laboratory capabilities expanded, preserved evidence acquired increasing investigative value. This scientific progression occurred gradually rather than through a single discovery. Improvements in DNA extraction, amplification, profiling, statistical interpretation, contamination control, and quality assurance collectively transformed forensic biology into one of the most powerful investigative disciplines within modern criminal justice. The April Tinsley investigation reflected this cumulative evolution over 3 decades. The investigation further demonstrated that unsuccessful forensic testing should not necessarily be interpreted as investigative failure. During earlier stages of the inquiry, available DNA database comparisons did not identify the offender. Rather than concluding that biological evidence lacked value, investigators recognized that scientific limitations might eventually change. Continued evidence preservation ensured future opportunities remained available. Within forensic laboratories, the case reinforced the importance of maintaining rigorous quality standards. Every laboratory examination performed during a long-running investigation must remain scientifically defensible and legally reliable. Standardized procedures, accreditation requirements, proficiency testing, documentation protocols, and peer review all contribute to maintaining confidence in forensic conclusions presented during criminal proceedings. The case also contributed to broader discussions regarding investigative genetic genealogy. This emerging methodology demonstrated considerable potential for generating leads in selected cold cases involving preserved DNA evidence. At the same time, investigators emphasized that genealogy functions as an investigative tool rather than independent proof of criminal responsibility. Once genealogical analysis identifies potential family relationships, detectives must independently verify the resulting investigative lead through lawful evidence collection, forensic comparison, and traditional investigative procedure. This distinction remains essential for understanding the proper role of genealogy within criminal investigation. Beyond technical considerations, the April Tinsley investigation underscored the human dimension of cold cases. Families of homicide victims often endure years or decades without definitive answers. Maintaining communication with affected families remains an important responsibility for investigators even when no significant investigative developments occur for extended periods. The Fort Wayne community likewise experienced the long-term effects of the investigation. Residents who remembered April's disappearance in 1988 continued following developments decades later. Annual media coverage, community remembrance, and public interest reflected the lasting impact that unresolved violent crime can have upon local communities. For law enforcement agencies, the investigation demonstrated the practical value of formal cold case review programs. Periodic reassessment of unsolved homicides allows investigators to identify opportunities created by scientific advances, newly available databases, or improved investigative methodologies. Cases previously considered unlikely to be solved may become viable candidates for renewed investigation as technology evolves. Training within police academies and homicide units increasingly incorporates lessons derived from investigations such as April Tinsley. Detectives are encouraged to preserve evidence comprehensively, document investigative decisions thoroughly, remain informed regarding scientific developments, and recognize that today's unsolved case may benefit from tomorrow's technology. The investigation also reinforced an important philosophical principle within criminal justice. The passage of time does not diminish the obligation to pursue justice. While practical challenges increase as witnesses age, memories fade, and investigators retire, carefully preserved evidence retains its potential investigative value. Scientific progress may continue long after a crime has occurred, creating opportunities unavailable during earlier stages of an investigation. Looking back, investigators frequently observed that the ultimate resolution of the April Tinsley case depended upon decisions made consistently over 3 decades rather than upon a single dramatic breakthrough. Evidence technicians preserved biological material. Detectives documented investigative activity. Evidence custodians maintained secure storage. Laboratory scientists revisited preserved samples as technology advanced. Prosecutors ensured legal procedures remained sound. Each contribution proved essential to the eventual outcome. The investigation therefore serves as an enduring example of how persistence, scientific advancement, and institutional commitment can intersect to resolve crimes long after their commission. Rather than illustrating one extraordinary investigative technique, the case demonstrates the cumulative